Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Friday Ramblings, and we're here to wrap up a little bit of an ongoing series we've been doing. That's right, folks. We've talked about the motion picture industry's two eras of trying to keep a little order to the chaos when it comes to what should and should not be shown by the public and how they should be informed of the contents of said artistes. We've discussed how the TV industry did it. We discussed how video game industry did it, and now we're going to wrap things up with the comics industry. One of the most infamous examples of the comics, or of self-censorship in lieu of letting the government take over. So let's break it all down. It all started in September 1954 in response to a widespread public concern over graphic violence and horror imagery in comic books. And the important thing to note for people in the modern age that read comic books is that mainstream comic books were not just superhero stuff like you tend to see now. Comic books had gone through a period where there was war comics, which depicted very real-life style violence. There were crime comics. There were horror comics, including the comics that inspired such modern-era things as Tales from the Crypt, a fan favorite TV show of ours we've discussed in the past. So there really was a genuine concern that, much like with other entertainment industries, anything could get published, and it was all being put in stores where anybody of any age could get to it. However, everything came to a head when Frederick Wortham, a psychiatrist, published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, which led to a series of Senate hearings. Now, Seduction of the Innocent is going to take a whole nother episode to cover in and of itself. The basics of it is Wortham, as a psychiatrist, felt that comic books were a negative form of popular literature and a serious cause of juvenile delinquency. Because of his credibility as a psychiatrist, Frederick Wortham's book was taken very seriously. So, Senate hearings. This sounds familiar, like something we've seen before. Yes! Kind of like movies and video games. That's right. Senate hearings came in. Senate thought maybe they should deal with something. The comic industry said, you know what, we'll take care of this ourselves. We apologize. If this is what the American people want, American people will get it. We do not need the government telling us what we can and can't publish. And so, the Comics Magazine Association of America was formed. It named New York Magistrate Charles F. Murphy, a specialist in juvenile delinquency, to head the organization and devise a self-policing code of ethics and standards for the industry. He then subsequently established the Comics Code Authority, basing its code upon the largely unenforced code drafted by the Association of Comic Books Magazine Publishers from 1948, which in turn had been modeled loosely after Hollywood's Hays Code. See how it all comes around, and we talk about things in a particular order. So you see an ongoing, this influences this thing. Yes, that's right, the Hays Code, which had proven to get the movie industry back under control, served as the two steps removed inspiration for the Comics Code Authority. And the reason that this was really essential is that before the CCA was adopted, some cities had already organized public burnings and bans on comic books. Oklahoma City and Oklahoma and Houston, Texas, had passed ordinances banning crime and horror comics, although an attempt by Los Angeles County, California, was deemed unconstitutional by their courts. Now, this wasn't even really just something that affected comics that a lot of people could agree should not be read by little children. Even the infamously conservative Archie books were affected. Editor Victor Gorlick reminisced about the coming of the code, once writing that, "My first assignment as a new art assistant was to remove cleavages and lift up low-cut blouses on Katie Keene." He also wrote of Archie artist Harry Lucci that his sometimes suggestive storytelling almost cost him his job. When his penciled stories came in, the characters were dressed on one page only. The inker, a woman, would have had to clothe them on the remaining pages. Now, it is important to note that much like the earlier codes from the other entertainment industries we discussed, like the Hays Code, technically the CCA had no official control over the comic publishers, and many distributors who were not publishing a lot of stuff that Frederick Wortham objected to directly refused to carry comics which, did not carry the seal. Some distributors, such as Dell Comics and Gold Key Comics, did not display the seal because their output was subject to a higher authority, as many of their licensors included Walt Disney and producers of TV shows aimed at children. Thus, their stuff was already getting censored under a general, hey, we wouldn't put this on TV, you're not putting it in the comic book mindset, which worked out nicely for them. Now, some publishers thrived under these restrictions. Marvel and DC managed to continue to chug along, and the rise of the re-rise of the superhero genre in the Silver Age really cemented the fact that neither company needed those infamous crime and horror comics that were most often targeted by concerned parents and politicians. However, others went out of business, especially EC Comics, as publisher William Gaines had specialized in crime and horror. And in fact, part of the CCA was that the words crime, horror, and terror were forbidden to use in comic book titles, and thus many of his stories, many of his anthology books, such as Crime Suspense Stories, The Vault of Horror, and Tales from the Crypt, although sales had been dipping on them in recent years, he would have had to retitle and remarket them in order to get a CCA stamp, if not flat out start massively censoring. Thus, EC Comics hit a really, really low period of time and would eventually start spending less time publishing. Wortham himself dismissed the code as an inadequate half measure. As we said, he was basically out to eliminate comics as a medium altogether. Still, the politicians accepted it. Although there were various headbuttings, including from our just mentioned friend William Gaines, a very historically important confrontation between publisher and CCA was when William Gaines reprinted the story Judgment Day from the pre-code era Weird Fantasy 18 in Incredible Science Fiction number 33. The reprint was a replacement for the code-rejected story An Eye for an Eye. The Judgment Day was itself also objected to because of the central character being black or African American, person of color, whatever your preferred nomenclature is. The idea is that when this story was reprinted in 1956, a lot of America really was not ready for stories where the central protagonist was not Caucasian. It is the nature of the times, folks. We're not saying who's right or wrong in this situation. We're just reporting historical information. The story, which was written by Al Feldstein and artist Joe Orlando, was an allegory against racial prejudice, a point which was necessarily nullified if the lead character was not a minority. Following an order by Code Administrator Judge Charles Murphy to change the final panel, which depicted the astronaut removing his helmet and revealing for the first time in the story he was a black person. See, it was a big twist. You didn't know until the last panel. Gaines engages in a heated dispute with Murphy, threatening to inform the press of Murphy's objections to the story if they did not give the issue code seal, causing Murphy to reverse his initial decision and allow the story to run. Soon after, however, facing the severe restrictions placed upon his comics by the CCA, and with his code-approved New Direction titles floundering, Gaines quit the comic book publishing to concentrate on Mad Magazine. Real quick, here's the code as it was set up in 1954. Again, some of this is going to sound very familiar to folks that watched our video on the Hays Code. Crime shall never be presented in such ways to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. If crime is depicted, it shall be as a sordid and unpleasant activity. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way to create disrespect for established authority. Criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous or to occupy a position which creates a desire for emulation. In every instant, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Scenes of excessive violence shall be prohibited. Scenes of brutal torture, excessive and unnecessary knife and gunplay, physical agony, the gory and gruesome crime shall be eliminated. No comic magazine shall use the words horror or terror in its title. All scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism shall not be permitted. All lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. Inclusion of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly so as not to injure the sensibilities of the reader. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism, also known as lycanthropy, are prohibited. Profanity, obscenity, smut, vulgarity, or words or symbols which have acquired undesirable meanings are forbidden. Nudity in any form is prohibited, as is indecent or undue exposure. Suggestive and salacious illustration or suggestive posture is unacceptable. Females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. Illicit sex relations are neither to be hinted at nor portrayed. Rape scenes as well as sexual abnormalities are unacceptable. Seduction and rape shall never be shown or suggested. Sex perversion or any inference to same is strictly forbidden. Nudity with meretricious purpose and salacious postures shall not be permitted in the advertising of any product. Clothed figures shall never be presented in such a way as to be offensive or contrary to good taste or morals. Fun times! Again, though, some of the best writers actually found themselves creatively challenged by the CCA and kind of appreciated the fact that they were no longer allowed to use basically cheap pop style art and storytelling. You could still write horror and criminal stuff, you could still write stuff with a romantic twist, but the dialogue had to drive it, not the shocking art. Those briefly upon a contention between DC Comics and the CCA due to writer Marv Wolfman's last name. In the Supernatural Mystery Anthology House of Secrets number 83, the book's host introduces the story as told to him by, quote, a wandering wolfman. CCA rejected the story and flagged the Wolfman reference as a violation. Fellow writer Jerry Conway explained to the CCA that the story's author was in fact named Wolfman and asked whether it would still be in violation if that was clearly stated. The CCA agreed that it would not be as long as Wolfman received the writer's credit on the first page of the story. This led to DC beginning to credit creators in its supernatural mystery anthologies. Frankly, it's a lesser crime because I like the idea of having your staff credits up front. Let people know from the get-go who's involved. Now, the code was revised a number of times during 1971 to allow for other things, the sometimes sympathetic depiction of criminal behavior and corruption among public officials, as well as permitting some criminal activities to kill law enforcement officers for the sake of setting up the story of them getting punished for their crimes. The classic suggestive posture is unacceptable was removed. Also newly allowed were vampires, ghouls, and werewolves, but only when handled in the classic traditions such as Frankenstein, Dracula, and other high-caliber literary works, such as those written by Edgar Allan Poe, Sci-fi, Conan Doyle, and other respected authors whose works are read in schools around the world. Zombies, lacking that requisite literary background, remain taboo. To get around this restriction, Marvel in the mid-1970s called the apparently deceased mind control followers of various Haitian supervillains Zuvembis. This practice carried over to Marvel's superhero line. In the Avengers story, when the reanimated superhero Wonder Man returns from the dead, he is referred to as a Zuvembi. DC Comics published their own zombie story in Swamp Thing number 16 when the deceased rise from the graves, while a soul-devouring demon appears in Swamp Thing number 15. Now, around this time, the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare approached Marvel Comics editor-in-chief Stan Lee to do a story about drug abuse. Lee agreed and wrote a 3-part Spider-Man story portraying drug use as dangerous and unglamorous. While the code did not specifically forbid depictions of drugs, a general clause prohibited all elements or techniques not specifically mentioned herein, which are contrary to the spirit and intent of the code and are considered violations of good taste or decency. CCA had proved at least one previous story involving drugs, the premiere of Dead Man in Strange Adventures 205, which was a DC comic, not Marvel, which clearly depicted the title character fighting opium smugglers. However, Code Administrator Leonard Darvin was, quote, ill at the time of the Spider-Man story, and Acting Administrator John L. Goldwater, also the publisher of Archie Comics, refused to grant Code approval because of the depiction of narcotic being used regardless of the context. Whereas the Dead Man story depicted only a wholesale business transaction. Confident the original government request would give him credibility, and with the approval of his publisher Martin Goodman, Lee ran the story in The Amazing Spider-Man 96 through 98 without CCA approval. The storyline was well received, and CCA's argument for denying approval was deemed counterproductive. Stan Lee quoted in a later 1998 interview that that was the only big issue they had ever had with the code. Lee and Marvel did draw criticism from DC head Carmine Infantino for defying the code, stating that DC will, quote, not do any drug stories unless the code is changed. As a result of publicity surrounding the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare sanctioning the storyline, however, the CCA revised the code to permit the depiction of narcotics or drug addiction if presented as a vicious habit. This allowed DC to itself to broach the topic in the code-approved Green Arrow, Green Lantern 85, with writer Denny O'Neil and artist Neil Adams, beginning a story arc involving Green Arrow's teen sidekick Speedy, aka Roy Harper, as a heroin addict. This would end up becoming one of DC's most all-time celebrated and enjoyed stories, as it was seen as a very realistic depiction of both what heroin addiction is like and that the rehab process is a lifelong commitment. In fact, the idea of Roy Harper being a former drug addict became a major character aspect for the rest of his run at DC. Many times him using his experience to relate to other heroes who are going through other similar kinds of addictions and needing a sympathetic shoulder to lean on. So good times. Ultimately, throughout the 80s and 90s, though, there was a breakaway from the Comics Code Authority. In 1984, the Comics Code Authority denied Swamp Thing issue 29 the seal of approval. DC decided to continue publishing the title without it. Subsequent DC series, such as The Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, both of which premiered in 86, would launch without ever having had the CCA seal of approval, and DC's subsequent Vertigo imprint in the 90s covered areas including horror and did not launch with CCA approval. Ultimately, as the 21st century would come around, CCA would find itself limping along on its last legs. 2001, CCA rejected an issue of the Marvel Comics series X-Force, requiring changes to be made. Instead, Marvel simply stopped submitting its comics to CCA. 2010, Bongo Comics, famous for their Simpsons licensed comics, discontinued using the code without any announcements regarding its abandonment. In 2010, some publishers, including Archie, placed the seal on their comics without submitting them through the formal channels. Archie Comics president Mike Pellerito stated that the code did not affect his company the way it did others, as we aren't about to start stuffing bodies in refrigerators, a reference to a infamous Kyle Rayner Green Lantern story, which has led to the modern slang term fridging. Again, another topic for another time. On January 20th, 2011, DC Comics announced it would discontinue participation, adopting a more modernized rating system similar to Marvel's itself, inspired by the movie and TV codes of, mature, teen, everybody. Essentially, more of a not so much seal of, hey, this passes censorship review, as, okay, here's a general idea of the level of content you're getting in this book style, which, again, was something the other entertainment industries had moved to a few decades before. Ultimately, this meant that as the 2010s chugged on, that the CCA was essentially abandoned. The last lingering aspect of this was Archie Comics, who was the only publisher still participating in the code by and large, announced it was going to also discontinuing it, which meant the code was, for all intents and purposes, dead. Now, the intellectual property rights to the Comics Code seal was purchased from the defunct CMAA by the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, a fine charitable organization that does good work, and which means that the idea of the CCA still exists, even if it does not have editorial control. Comics Code seal can be seen among the production logos and the opening shots of the 2018 superhero film Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and its 2023 sequel, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Which brings us to your wrap-up. So the Comics Code Authority, much like the similar Hays Code, was designed to rein in comic books at a time when conservatism was leading the way in our culture, and it was time to quit publishing whatever your writers and artists felt like doing, reining in the, quote, Wild West mentality. Now, as we've said before, many companies, by and large, didn't have a problem with the CCA. They found loopholes and workarounds, and writers and artists would sometimes consider it a fun, creative challenge. When it's all said and done, though, the era passed because culture changed once again, and it became more about consumers making informed decisions instead of simply not letting the content get put out there to the public. Now, personally, I prefer the modern system, but it is important to note that even with a modern system where you tell people, look, this stuff has mature content, there's still a point where you have to ask yourself, is this being done in good taste? Because, all the M ratings aside, if you're putting stuff out there just to freak people out and create panic and shock tactic reactions, you're gonna stir the waters, and you keep stirring the waters, you're not gonna like what's gonna happen. I think that is the ultimate moral lesson of everything we do here. whether it's movies, TV, comic books, video games, every aspect of entertainment has a period of time, and some of them are still in it, such as the SRB, where there is a level of quality control and content rating in order to make sure that people don't just subject everybody to everything without any sense of responsibility. That's what you want in life. Artistic creativity should allow to be free, but you should recognize just because you're excited about your artistic creation doesn't mean everybody wants to be exposed to it. So give them fair warning. On that note, I'm out for another 7 days, but don't despair because Roulette Productions will continue to chug along. Right now without government oversight. Hopefully it'll stay that way. Appreciate everybody who watches. Stay happy and healthy.